Hello and welcome back. In this video we're continuing our series on essential skills, and this time we're going to take a look at camera controls and settings, because a lot of people read their manual once, if that, and then start to use their camera but they don't fully understand what all of the controls mean or do. And we'll take a little look as well at why your camera or how your camera lies to you about what it's doing. So let's dive in and get started. So in this video we're going to explore some of these essential skills, and in this video we're going to be talking about some basic camera types and uses, a little bit of a discussion about how good smartphones are compared to a dedicated camera. We'll talk about how your camera lies to you in some instances when you're photographing in the field, and then we're going to look at in detail some of the basics of controlling exposure, because while for some people this will be a review and will be things they already know, for others it'll be an explanation of things they just don't fully understand. And then beyond that we'll have a look at means of adjusting what the camera is trying to do and how you take charge of the camera. So let's get started now with just looking at what a camera is. And the modern camera is very similar to the old camera obscura, which was basically an enclosed room with a very small hole in it that allowed the light from outside to form a picture on the opposite wall. And this is an old illustration of how artists would work back in the 17th or 18th century. And if we look now at our modern digital cameras, essentially we have the same thing. We have a light-proof box, we have a fancy lens attached to the front, and we have a means inside of recording the light that's coming through. So in principle they haven't really changed from those very early days. We have multiple camera types these days. We have the smartphone camera that has really largely taken the place of what used to be the compact camera that everybody used to carry around. Now everybody has a phone and we tend to use that. And then of course we have things like drones and other means of recording photos in a way that we couldn't do otherwise. And then looking at more conventional things, we have the crop sensor mirrorless cameras, we have the full frame sensor mirrorless cameras, we have the digital DSLR, and of course we have the large medium format cameras. And they all do largely the same thing but at different qualities. Obviously a smartphone is going to be costing you a few $100s, whereas something like this type of medium format camera could cost you up to $50,000. And of course the important thing with all of these cameras is the type of sensor, or the size of the sensor and the resolution of the sensor. And we always talk about full frame as being the standard, if you like, of digital photography. And the full frame really just means that it's based on the old 35mm film standard, which was a 36 by 24mm piece of film. And then from that we go to the crop sensor, which is a slightly smaller sensor that Canon and Nikon and many other manufacturers use. And then we go down smaller again to the micro four thirds and other types of sensors, down to the smaller ones such as you'll find in your smartphone. And these are important because the size of the sensor and the number of pixels, or the resolution of the sensor, determines in some way the quality of the images you're going to get. So the question then is, let's look at a smartphone compared to a modern DSLR. And a lot of people are forever telling us, people who are basically non-photographers, oh yes, I can take photos with my smartphone that are every bit as good as you do with your high-powered fancy DSLR, and they can be printed to poster size. Well, of course this is complete nonsense. In good conditions, under ideal lighting, you won't see a lot of difference between a smartphone photograph and a DSLR image. And of course if you're looking on a screen on a phone, you'll never pick the difference. But if you start to look at one of these smartphone images, and this is just a random one I took a few days ago, and you zoom in and take a closer look, you'll start to see that there's a lot of quality issues with the capture from the smartphone, because there's a lot of computational work going on, there's a lot of compression, and of course it's not going to match the quality of the type of image you can get from a dedicated DSLR or other form of high quality camera. And if you want to get a bit more information about the comparison between a smartphone and a good quality digital camera, the website DP Review has an interesting article where one of their writers made an in-depth analysis of the quality difference between the two types of camera. Enough said, a smartphone can't take a photograph as good as a dedicated DSLR or other high quality camera. And moving on, there's another problem we have, or I've called it the elephant in the room, and that is when we're working with our camera in the field, we have some issues with things it lies to you about. For instance, when you're using a DSLR, we're looking through the viewfinder, which is actually looking through the lens. And so we're not actually seeing the same image that's being recorded. And on a mirrorless camera or a DSLR, if you're using live view or the equivalent, what you're seeing is an image on the screen, but it's not the actual raw file that you're recording. It's a JPEG preview based on the data that's coming onto the screen. And in the very early days of digital photography, there were no raw files. It was all JPEGs or TIFFs. And so it was quite reasonable to expect that all you were really looking for was a JPEG version of the image that you could view on the back screen. But the problem is there's a few issues with rendering a raw file into a JPEG within the camera. And the most important one of those is that when you're looking at the histogram, the information that you're getting from that is not accurate because it's also based on the JPEG version of the image. So when you're out in the field photographing and you're looking at the image on the back of the screen or through the viewfinder with a mirrorless camera, you're not entirely seeing what you're going to get. And especially with the histogram on the back of the camera, it's based on the JPEG, and that's a little bit different from what you are really getting. So that when you take your image from the camera, and here's a simulation of an image where it was indicating highlight clipping, and take that image into Lightroom and open it up with the default settings, you'll see quite clearly that the image has no clipping, because this time you're looking at the raw file and the raw conversion by Lightroom from that data, whereas on the back of the camera you're looking at the JPEG. And so it's quite a different thing. So we can't entirely rely on what our camera is telling us. And the reason for that is, this is what happens when you make a photograph with your camera. The sensor records the image, the camera reads out all of this information, interpolates the red, blue and green information, applies white balance, contrast, saturation, compression, and produces a JPEG file. And that's what you see on the back of the camera. Whereas if you're opening the raw file, it bypasses all of this stuff that's done within the camera. So it's never going to be exactly the same. And that's something you just have to be aware of. And just looking at that as a slightly different way, if we take our raw data and we're looking at 12 or 14-bit raw data, we have potentially up to 16,384 possible levels of tone. And when that raw file is converted into a JPEG image, all of those tones are compressed down into a maximum of 256 levels. And during that process, some of the highlights are clipped and some of the shadows are clipped. And of course, we're talking about different color spaces and so forth. So it's going to be an entirely different thing. So let's now move on and look at what happens when we try and control the exposure with our cameras. And we have what's called the holy trinity of controls: the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO sensitivity of the sensor. And those three things are used together to control exposure. So let's have a look at those. So how do these three factors work together? Well, looking at this diagram, you can see that with a very large aperture, the image will be brighter. With a small aperture, the image will be darker, and the same with shutter speed. With a very fast shutter speed, the image will be darker, and with a long shutter speed, it'll be lighter. And the same with the ISO settings. Or looking at it a slightly different way, for any given equal amount of exposure, we want to change the shutter speed. For instance, if we want a slower shutter speed, we're going to need a smaller aperture if we don't change the ISO. Or if we want to use a faster shutter speed, we will need a larger aperture to compensate. Or if we wanted to use a faster shutter speed and not change the aperture, we would need to use higher ISO. So these three factors work together, and overall will give you the exposure that the camera requires. And looking at these three factors together, here's a diagram that shows the individual steps in aperture change. And unfortunately, the numbers used for aperture are very confusing for a lot of people. We start with our widest size aperture, which generally would be f1.4, and then we go to smaller apertures. And the important thing to remember here is each time we make a full step difference in aperture, we're halving the area of the circle or the hole that the light's passing through. So from f1.4 to f2, that is one step of exposure, or 1/2 reduction in area. And each time we move along in this way, we go to half again, and the same thing with our shutter speeds. It's easier to see with shutter speeds. If we have a 1/2 second shutter speed and we change to a 1/4 second, that's obviously halving the amount of time the shutter's open. And if we go from a 1/4 to an 1/8, we're halving that again, and so forth. And these are pretty much equal steps. We go from an 1/8 to a 15th. It's not quite exactly half, but it's close. And then with the third factor is the ISO settings. If we start with a base ISO, most cameras would have a base ISO setting of 100 or 64. If we go from 100 to 200 ISO, we're doubling the sensitivity of the sensor. And if we go from 200 to 400, we're doubling that again. And the most important thing to understand in photography with a relationship between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO is that each full step difference is doubling or halving the amount of light reaching the sensor. And so we end up with a combination of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO to give us what the camera requires for exposure. So let's now look at another way to have a look at that, and this is from another website that I borrowed this image from. If we take the ISO as being like a bucket that we need to fill with water, each time we change the ISO sensitivity from 100 to 200, the bucket gets smaller. We need less light to make the same exposure. And then the same thing with shutter speeds. We go from a very fast shutter speed to longer shutter speeds, and once we get down to this sort of range, a 30th or a 15th, we start to get to a problem where we can't handhold the camera without getting movement. And then with apertures, we go the same way. Each one is halving or doubling the amount of light getting through. And one last thing that's really important to remember, we've looked here at each of these as being one full step difference in exposure or ISO or aperture, but just bear in mind that most modern cameras work in 1/3 stops between these individual settings, so that between f4 and f5.6 there will usually be 2 other intermediate settings. But for clarity, we're sticking with these full increments of change to get the understanding across that we're either halving or doubling the amount of light reaching the sensor with each of these changes. So let's now have a little closer look at why we would use different settings, and starting with the aperture on the lens. And this is another diagram indicating the different sizes of aperture. Well, what does aperture do? Aperture controls how much of the image appears to be in focus. Now, of course, there is only really one plane of focus when you take a photograph, but by using a very small aperture, such as f8 or smaller, there will be a certain range of apparent sharpness in front of and behind the plane of focus that will look acceptably sharp. And we can use these aperture settings to control how much of our image looks sharp. And if we have a lens that will go all the way down to, say, f1.4, and we use it at its widest setting, we end up with a point where we only have one really small point of focus, and the rest of the image is out of focus. And that's a really beautiful way we can control the interest in a photograph. And in particular, this is one aspect where smartphones just can't compete, because they just don't have the ability to render this out of focus area, or bokeh as it's known in the photographic circles. But conversely, if we wanted to use a very small aperture, then a great deal of our image will appear to be sharply focused. And in particular, for landscapes, we would be looking at something like that. Let me just go back to that. So Using a small aperture, a lot of the image will appear to be in focus. A small aperture, most of the image will be out of focus, and that's a very important tool to be able to use in our photography. So then moving on from the use of the aperture, shutter speed obviously controls the amount of movement in the photograph. And when we talk about movement in a photograph, we're talking about not just the subject moving, but potentially the camera moving as well. And that opens us up to a whole range of different tools and things that we can use with our photography. So looking at this image, trying to capture a bird in flight, you need a very fast shutter speed to freeze the motion. And so something like an 800th or even less if the bird is moving quickly will be needed to freeze the motion. Or if in case of a landscape where you have moving water, which is a very popular technique, using a slow shutter speed of say between a second or 3 or 4 seconds will render the image very differently and give you that sense of movement. Or we can actually use both the camera and the subject moving with a very slow shutter speed to really generate the feeling of movement and action, purely with the use of the shutter speed as the controlling factor. And so we come to ISO sensitivity. And obviously the ISO sensitivity, when the manufacturers design their camera, they set the default or standard ISO setting, which is often 100, or on some cameras it might be 64. And at that setting of ISO sensitivity, you'll get the greatest dynamic range, you'll get the least noise and the best rendition of your image. And then as you increase the ISO sensitivity, it's a bit like turning up the volume on a stereo. If you turn it up too far, you start to get distortion. And in the case of ISO, you start to get more noise in the image, and you also lose a little bit of dynamic range. But by the same token, you will be able to capture images that you would not otherwise be able to do with the slower ISO setting. And so looking at those ISO settings again, each one of those, even though the numbers look very different, we're just doubling the numbers. 100 to 200 is one stop, 200 to 400 is one stop, 400 to 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, etc. Each time we do that, we're doubling the sensitivity of the sensor. So the important thing with ISO is that if we can photograph at the lowest or the default setting, we have the greatest dynamic range and the best quality. So photographing landscapes in good lighting, and whether on a tripod or not, you would use the lowest ISO setting possible. But there are situations where you're going to have to compromise. For instance, this photograph of a gorilla was taken in very poor lighting, and it was photographed on 8000 ISO in order to be able to handhold the camera and get a sharp image. And in processing, using both Adobe tools and some third-party tools, we're able to reduce the amount of noise and issues that come about using those very high ISO settings. So we've now had a look at what the different things do, aperture, shutter speed and ISO, and how they individually control different aspects of our photographic work. So now it's time to move on and have a look at how we control those exposure settings. And essentially there are 4 different ways that we can control exposure. We can instruct our camera to use the aperture as the priority by setting that on our camera, usually with a setting called A or AV on Canon cameras. We set the aperture and the camera does the rest. Or likewise, shutter priority, where we want the shutter as being the most important factor, we set that and the camera does the rest. Or if we really want to, we can use a fully manual setting where we set every aspect of the aperture, shutter speed and ISO. Or the opposite of that is program mode, where the camera is left to do its own thing, and generally that doesn't give us very satisfactory results. But of course, depending on the circumstance, we would use different types of methods of controlling. For instance, if we have moving subjects, sports action or wildlife or family pets, where movement is a problem, we want to freeze that movement, we would obviously use a shutter priority. Whereas if we're photographing a landscape, it's not moving very quickly, or hopefully not moving at all. And so therefore we would probably use something like aperture priority, or even fully manual if it's very difficult lighting situation. So the choice of what we use to take the photograph is really dependent on the subject that we're capturing. So let's just have a look at a few of those scenarios. Aperture priority. You set the aperture and the camera sets the shutter speed, and in some cases if you're using auto ISO, the camera will also change the ISO to maintain a predetermined minimum shutter speed. So for aperture priority, the most important use for that is where we're talking about controlling the depth of field, or the amount of the image that looks acceptably sharp. And in situations like this, landscape photography, we want depth and apparent sharpness all the way from the front of the image to the back. Or in architectural photography, we want to control the amount that looks sharp, and you would use an appropriate aperture for that. And also for more abstract type architectural work. Or then moving on to things like portraiture, where you want to control a very minimal amount of sharpness or depth of field. In this instance, we've just focused on the eye of the model, and the rest of it is allowed to run out of focus. Or in this candid shot, the same sort of situation, we wanted the model sharp but the background out of focus. In all of those instances, we would use aperture priority as the main tool in capturing the image. But let's now have a look at shutter priority. And this is the situation where controlling the movement in the photograph is the primary importance. So we determine the shutter speed, the camera sets the aperture, and either you set the ISO manually or use auto ISO. And we'll come on to auto ISO a little bit further on. And so the best use for this is where we want to control that movement. And as we saw with this image, where we want to freeze the motion of the dog running, we need to use a very fast shutter speed. And obviously, depending on the lens and the situation, probably high ISO and minimal aperture, as wide open as possible, to allow as much light in as possible. But in a different scenario, where we have a sports type situation, where we wanted to get that sense of movement, you would use a slow shutter speed, something like a 15th or a 20th of a second, and pan or move the camera in time with the motion so that you get that real sense of movement with what's going on. And the same thing here with the canoeist, slow shutter speed, trying to get the sense of movement and what's going on, and you can even take that to extremes. So the controlling use of the shutter speed is most important in these sort of scenarios. Or even in this instance where we've used a very long exposure, something like about 20 seconds, to flatten out the movement in the water and then give us a very tranquil sort of a feel in the image, obviously on a tripod. Or even in this instance where we've tried to record the storm and the drama of a passing storm, a long exposure will allow those lightning bolts to be captured throughout the exposure. So shutter priority has very wide range of uses depending on what the requirements are. And then of course we come to full manual, where you set everything, and this is really more designed for very tricky situations, but also situations where you have time to be able to modify settings to get the best option. And for instance, where you're learning the tools of exposure, it's a good idea to use full manual and see the different settings and what they do. But of course it can be a bit slow and cumbersome, so if you're trying to capture movement in sports and action, you're probably going to miss the action. But for things like this, where I've used a studio setup to photograph objects, you want to control the aperture, the shutter speed, and you'll probably be using artificial light, you're going to probably use full manual. Or in a situation like this, where it was extremely tricky lighting, where I needed to compensate for all that black area in photographing this building in Bhutan, I had to use manual settings to really control the amount of exposure, because the camera would want to tend to overexpose this. And of course, when you're using things like drones, you have a limited amount of control Often they have a fixed aperture, and they will determine the shutter speed and the ISO, so that you're pretty much at the control of the designers of the machine. And so with things like drones, you're pretty much at the behest of the people that designed the drones, and it effectively becomes like a program mode where the camera makes all the choices for better and for worse. And in a lot of instances, the cameras are designed to work within a limited set of parameters, and often it won't choose the most optimum setting. So the program mode is generally not recommended for any situation. But let's now look at a couple of other situations where we have different scenarios. Sometimes you need to use a mixture of techniques to get the best option available. For instance, macro photography, street photography can be a combination of aperture or shutter priority, and sometimes in travel photography you just want to be able to make a quick snapshot, and the same with family photos. So with things like this, where you've got a still life, you've got a subject that's not going to move, you can play around with different options. But oftentimes aperture priority is going to be your controlling factor, because you're trying to keep a certain amount in focus. The same with this close-up photograph of a clove of garlic or a bunch of garlic, where the amount that was sharply focused was really the most critical thing. But then situations like street photography, you would either use aperture or shutter priority, because you want to be able to respond to things that happen quickly. You'll see a little scenario, you'll want to be able to take that photograph quickly, and so either aperture or shutter priority with auto ISO would be the option of choice. And the same here, where you are traveling, you want to be able to make a quick response, and those tools are the most flexible. So there are a few further advanced options that we will have a look at now. And sometimes the camera doesn't get things right. We know that the camera lies to us a little bit with the information it displays to us, and sometimes we have to override what it thinks. In particular, we need to make some exposure compensation when the camera gets the metering wrong, and we need to sometimes choose a different metering method, the way that the camera measures the light coming through onto the sensor. And we mentioned before, setting controls on auto ISO. It's a very flexible tool, but it needs to be worked in to work within certain parameters. And for people learning photography, you need to work out what ISO setting you're comfortable with working up to the highest level, where you can comfortably control the noise, and that's something you need to do tests on. And the same thing with the shutter speeds. You need to work out what's the slowest shutter speed that you can comfortably handhold with a different range of lenses. So let's just quickly look at those. Exposure compensation really comes in when the camera doesn't quite get it right. And in most situations the camera will get things right, but sometimes with very unusual lighting it can be out. And sometimes even when you've taken a photograph and looked at the histogram, it will show you that the highlights are blown out when in fact they're not. And so we need to take control of that in some situations. And the problem being is that the metering in the camera, and regardless of which type of metering method you use, the camera is going to assume that there's somewhere in the middle of this range of brightness levels, there's a middle grey. And so if you present an image that's all white, in other words, say photographing snow, it's going to try and treat that as being a middle grey, and so it will tend to expose that as grey or make the image underexposed. And the same thing goes if your image is predominantly dark. The camera is going to try and render part of that in middle grey, and it will tend to overexpose. We'll look at a couple of more examples. And this is a very typical situation where you have an overcast sky, you're trying to photograph a landscape, and what happens is the camera reads this very bright area and says, well, I don't want to blow all of that out, so I'll tend to underexpose what's there. And this is that's what you end up with, but you really wanted something like this where you manage to control the exposure on the land and the sky. And sometimes you need to make two exposures, or you might just want to make an adjustment to what the camera is reading. And making exposure compensation work, all cameras will have an option somewhere that gives you a plus or a minus symbol on a button that you can press and dial in some exposure compensation, either to increase the exposure or to decrease the exposure. Nikon cameras have an option that's called easy exposure compensation that allows you to program the rear dial on the camera to dial in over or under exposure that then resets every time you turn the meter off. And this is a really handy tool, because one of the things that happens a lot is that people will dial in some exposure compensation to take a particular photograph and then forget about it, and then all of the rest of the photographs will be taken with that exposure compensation dialed in. So it's, exposure compensation is a really powerful tool, but you need to remember to turn it off or to reset it after you've taken that particular shot. And a lot of this exposure compensation comes about because of the different metering methods that cameras use. And here's a diagram that shows the different types of metering for the major brands, and they'll all have what's called a matrix or multi-segment metering system, where different parts of the viewfinder will be measured and different weightings applied to it. Or you have what's called a center weighted metering, where the middle part of the frame is the basis for the exposure reading. Or you can move down to what's called a spot reading, which basically they all call it spot reading, where a very small part of the photograph is only measured for the exposure. And then a couple of the other cameras have an option. The Sony cameras have an entire screen average option, and Canon has another partial metering option. But essentially there's different ways of applying weighting to the different parts of the photograph. And of course, which one is best? Well, of course, it depends on your subject. If you've got a situation where you've got a wide range of tones from light to dark and they're evenly distributed throughout the frame, then obviously using the default method of measuring the light, such as the matrix or multi-segment metering, is going to be the ideal situation, and that's the default setting that most cameras will come with. But when you get into situations like this one, where you've got a bright subject against a fairly dark background, often the camera will try and balance that dark background by overexposing the main part of the image. So in this situation, you would use that middle or center weighted metering to get the reading on the bird and let the background disappear. And taking that to an extreme where you have a very large amount of dark area behind your main subject, then you would probably want to use that spot metering and just meter off the person's skin so that the background can then run entirely out of or underexposed, because it's not important. So depending on those situations, you would perhaps want to use a different method of measuring the light coming through the camera. But in most cases, the matrix or segmented metering system is going to be your best friend. And now let's have a little look at the auto ISO settings, because most cameras these days have the option of allowing you to set the camera to change the ISO settings depending on the situation, and it will take into account the focal length of the lens and will give you a minimum shutter speed to maintain. Now in this instance, this is based on a Nikon setting. I've turned the auto ISO sensitivity on, and I've determined the maximum setting I want to use is 6400 ISO. You can determine that by doing some tests and set your own level. And then we have the option of a minimum shutter speed, and if you set it to auto, it will determine the minimum shutter speed based on the focal length of the lens, and it will vary the minimum shutter speed. Obviously, with a wide angle lens, very short focal length, it will allow you to use a much slower shutter speed. But if you're using a longer telephoto lens, it will keep that minimum shutter speed to a higher level. And you have the option here of determining how much of that faster or slower shutter speed is given weight to. But of course you need to work out those options for yourself. What is the maximum ISO that you're comfortable handling, and what is the slowest shutter speed you're comfortable holding? And of course, again, it depends on your subject. This photograph was taken at 12,800 ISO because the lighting was terrible and it was the only chance to get the photograph. Or this one was taken at 6400 ISO in very dim lighting conditions. Again, to allow to get the photograph handheld, and this one we've seen before was taken at 8000 ISO. And this photograph was taken at 8000 ISO because the lighting was very poor. It was taken handheld with a 600mm lens, and the shutter speed was 1/1250, so 1/1250th of a second at f6.3. And I knew that I could control the noise in the image with software. But again, in determining what is your minimum hand holding speed, it will depend on the focal length of the lens, but also when you get down to about a 30th of a second or slower, it gets very difficult to hand hold an image. With newer cameras with shake control or anti-vibration, you can get even slower speeds, but then again, with higher resolution sensors, any slight movement is magnified. So you need to do some tests using your camera and your settings to work out what is the best option. Here's an image that was taken handheld at a 15th of a second, pre-dawn, waiting to go up in a balloon. It's acceptably sharp, but I wouldn't try using that sort of a shutter speed on a longer focal length lens. And conversely, when you want to use a faster shutter speed, you really need to understand what you need to freeze the action. Something like a 500th or even faster than that to freeze action with moving animals in particular. You may even need to go up into the thousandths of a second to capture an image. But of course, as we said, with landscapes, nothing is moving, and you've got the time and ability to use low ISO and long shutter speeds and just pick that moment. So I hope in going through these basic camera controls and having a look at what each of these controls do and how we can override those when necessary, I hope that we haven't left you all at sea and lost in trying to work out how to control your camera. As always, individual uses will differ, but having an understanding of how ISO, shutter speed and aperture work together and how we can control them is going to give you the tools to be able to make some beautiful photographs. I hope that's all been useful, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.